All right, we're going to talk about Chapter 16 in the autonomic nervous system. So, this is a relatively brief chapter because we already talked a lot about the nervous system in our prior unit. And so, if you remember, the other half of our peripheral nervous system was the somatic nervous system. And so, we talked about sensory and motor and afferent and efferent. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but we are going to talk about the primary divisions of sympathetic and parasympathetic. And what we're really going to talk about is highlighting the differences between those divisions as we go through. All right. So there's a motor system or an efferent part of the autonomic system as well. Just like the rest of our nervous system, its end goal is to maintain homeostasis, maintain that balance, and it's responsible for our automatic or involuntary activities. So this is going to include glands, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. You'll see one of our muscle tissues here is missing. That is skeletal muscle. And remember, that goes with the somatic half of our system. We talk about this with parasympathetic and sympathetic. So remember, parasympathetic is rest and digest. Kind of everything slows down except for our digestive and urinary system. For sympathetic, we say fight or flight. I always use the example of running from a bear. So all of our systems are going to be amped up, but you don't want to be hungry. You don't want to have to go to the bathroom. So those are our two systems that are kind of slowed down by the sympathetic division. The parasympathetic division we also note as the craniosacral outflow. And so that tells us exactly where it's coming from. Cranium, in terms of our brain stem, especially. And then the sacral division, obviously down at the sacral portion, the very bottom of our spinal cord. If you remember when we went through the different plexuses of the system, we had the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, and the lumbosacral plexus. We skipped over that middle portion of the spinal cord, our thoracic division, and that's because that's really where our sympathetic division comes into play. All right, some differences in somatic versus autonomic. So one of the big ones here, like I said, skeletal muscle is going to be the effector or the efferent portion of that somatic system. And most of our neurons or axons specifically that we talked about were myelinated because we wanted those signals to be really quick and efficient. There is also myelination of the lower motor neuron. So myelinated upper and lower, right in the structure. And like I said, that's going to be our voluntary control of that skeletal muscle. In our autonomic system, this is one of the areas where we have unmyelinated neurons, but you'll also see this distinction where we say preganglionic versus postganglionic. And so preganglionic means this neuron before the ganglion. Remember, the ganglion is a gang of nerves. And so when we say nerves, we're talking specifically about the dendrites and cell bodies. So our preganglionic neuron is going to be here in the spinal cord. Our postganglionic neuron cell body will be in the ganglion itself. The postganglionic neuron is typically unmyelinated. So an unmyelinated postganglionic neuron in our division here, it's these dotted lines that represent unmyelinated. And so again, here's your reminder. This is going to go to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, as well as glands. Remember, glands are a special type of epithelium, and oftentimes they have some smooth muscle associated with them related to their secretions. All right, so this one's an easy one because whether we're parasympathetic or sympathetic, we're always going to release acetylcholine as this neurotransmitter from our preganglionic neuron. So regardless of which division, the preganglionic neuron is going to secrete acetylcholine. So we call it a cholinergic neuron. So it's got cholinergic receptors. In the parasympathetic division, we stick with acetylcholine. So if it's parasympathetic, no matter whether it's pre or post, it's going to be acetylcholine. If it's preganglionic, no matter whether it's parasympathetic or sympathetic, it's acetylcholine. The only difference we get here is in the sympathetic division, the postganglionic neuron is now going to be adrenergic, and that is going to be norepinephrine. So norepinephrine, epinephrine, same difference. That other word for that is adrenaline. And so this is the only spot where we see that norepinephrine neurotransmitter released. All right, so our sympathetic division, we call that the thoracolumbar outflow, most of it located within the thoracic portion of our spinal cord. And if you remember from our spinal cord cross section, the lateral horn is where the motor output from our autonomic system is going to come from. So these are going to be in the lateral horn of the spinal cord in T1 through L2. And remember, that's going to be our preganglionic neuron. And so we usually in the sympathetic division have a relatively short preganglionic neuron, and then the postganglionic neuron is going to be much longer. And you'll see here we have a couple that have multiple ganglions a little bit closer. That's kind of a nice to know. Don't worry too much about which ones have that extra stop. So the sympathetic chain is also known as paravertebral ganglia because they lay right outside of that vertebral column. And then we have the collateral ganglia. That would be these guys here that are within the abdominopelvic cavity. And so these are the ganglia that are a little closer to their targets. So sympathetic chain, really short preganglionic right here by the spinal cord, and then some of them branch out to that collateral or what we call a prevertebral ganglia. For parasympathetic, this is our craniosacral outflow. And so we have a few cranial nerves involved in this division, as well as some sacral nerves down at the very bottom of the spinal cord. The vagus nerves, cranial nerve 10, is really important for the parasympathetic division when it comes to regulating heart rate, our digestion, and breathing. So 90% of the neurons that are in charge of those structures all arise from the vagus nerve. So you can see that here, that branches off big time. And so this is kind of the opposite. And you'll see that a lot with parasympathetic and sympathetic. We have much longer preganglionic neurons that are myelinated, and then the ganglia lie very close to their structure. So we call those terminal ganglia that are right here, really close to where they're supplying in the or the effector that they'll supply. So this table is a bit much, but it's a great thing to look at to see all the different effects of the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. If you remember that rest and digest versus fight or flight, that will help you a lot. So for rest and digest for parasympathetic, that is going to be kind of shutting down or slowing everything down except for the digestive and urinary system. For sympathetic, that's going to kind of amp everything up except for uh, the digestive and urinary system. And so some examples that go along with this are listed here below. So these are really good examples that you should take a look at in terms of studying. All right, this just talks about some of the higher CNS influencing components. So we have our cerebrum and limbic system that's going to influence the ANS through emotion and thought, and it's going to really go through the hypothalamus. We can consider the hypothalamus that autonomic nervous center, the integration center for the autonomic nervous system. We just talked about the role the brainstem has, especially with the parasympathetic system. And then, of course, the spinal cord has a lot of reflex centers. Some examples of this are defecation and urination, as well as erection and ejaculation. Those are autonomic reflexes that travel straight through the spinal cord. Pupil size is a reflex that travels directly through the brainstem. And so that's another one that you can remember as an autonomic system reflex. All right, we're all done here with the autonomic system.